First, I want to thank everyone for joining. Welcome. I will be fixing my name when Miriam and Faye speak because it's not shown correctly. But I'm Ed Zimmerman, which you'll see when it is shown correctly with my pronouns. And this is VentureCrush. And I want to make clear today in particular that the statements that I make are my own problem, not necessarily Lowenstein Sandler's problem or the problem of any other business with which I am affiliated or associated. And I want to just thank a couple of people who also should not be held responsible for anything I say, who were involved in today's event. Latoya Bethune and Shelmy Ulis are two of the lawyers who are colleagues of mine in the tech group, and they had the, I think, enviable task of doing some research on our extraordinary speakers, Faye Waddleton and Miriam Rivera. I also want to thank Katie and Brittany and Jenny, Betty, Ginny, Caroline and Rachel, and Karen Ernst, who together constitute the VentureCrush team. I would have added Carrie Fisk, who is out on parental leave, so whatever happens today is not her fault. And with that, let's talk a little bit about who our speakers are. We have links to their bios in the group chat, and I'll do a little bit of an intro. We're going to do some personal background on them. I think that I've been very clear that we're definitely going to be talking about reproductive rights. We're going to be talking about Planned Parenthood. We're going to be talking about being very much in favor of reproductive rights. The word abortion will get used a whole bunch. And if those things create discomfort for you, if you're sticking around, you have opted into that conversation. If you would like to exit, totally fine at any time. But I think, first person singular, that it's an extraordinarily important issue at an extraordinarily important time. We are also going to talk about venture capital. We're going to talk about tech. We're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about quantum computing as well. So you're welcome to stick around for those things. You have also opted into a discussion about quantum computing. And if that makes you uncomfortable, you're welcome to exit the Zoom as well. So with that, Miriam, I'm just going to mention one or two things about Faye, and then talk to Faye very briefly, and then about you, and then we will do a deeper dive on everyone. Faye, it's not, there are so many places we could start with you, but it really isn't every day that we get to talk to someone who precluded a Supreme Court justice from serving. So I'm going to start there. There's this terrific Washington Post profile of you from the period in which you led the charge for the first time in Planned Parenthood's history to tank the nomination of Judge Bork, who would have been Justice Bork. And that is just one milestone in an historic career that has ranged from Fortune 500 public company boardrooms to being the CEO of one of the 10 largest nonprofits in the nation, which is the oldest reproductive rights nonprofit, where you were the longest serving leader, and I believe the first woman, and definitely the first Black woman, and the youngest woman to ever be at the helm. And you came into power there shortly after Roe, and you were there for the entire Reagan presidency, which was not hospitable. And you endured bombings and violence and death threats to do your job. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing now with co-founding a quantum computing company, and maybe a little bit about where you're from originally?
Well, Ed, let me just say that I'm really delighted and privileged to have this conversation with you and Miriam Brava for the career and your accomplishments. So I'm the lucky ducky here today to be a part of this circle. I came to Quantum AeroQ Quantum Hardware by invitation of one of the co-founders to become a co-founder because the group wished to form a company that was anchored in ethical considerations and standards along with the development of its sciences. And we joined together in 2015 to form a quantum hardware development. We have continued on that path, and it's a very complex path. It's a challenging one because most people have not heard the word quantum before, let alone that it represents the next generation of information processing in a totally different area of science and technology and engineering. So I have been very fortunate, as has been the case in most of my career, if not all of my career, to apply past experiences to assisting the development of this young company to be what we believe will be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in not very many years in the future. I don't want to get too much into the explanation of quantum computing because it presents complexities that cause people to gloss over, but it really does represent an opportunity and as it evolves, a revolution in our capacity to deepen our knowledge about the world, about science, about nature, about how we can preserve our planet, how we can foster and advance a better life for the future of the inhabitants that we leave behind. And so it's sort of an extension of what I've done all of my career, which is to look to the future for prevention, for embracing problems and seeking ways to solve them. Most profoundly in my Planned Parenthood years, running an organization that helps people to address their daily lives in a way that gives them hope and power over their future and their ability to form families and to control their reproduction. It's forward thinking, not backward thinking, even though we are now in the midst of a great backward revolution to restore women to the dark days of illegality. So I've had a long journey. I'm really lucky. That's how I feel about it, to have been placed at a certain place at a certain time in history, that my background as a nurse, as a master's in midwifery, as someone who has deep knowledge and experience in public health, to apply that preparation, and even as the daughter of a fundamentalist Protestant minister, to understand the language of those people who opposed my work and who threatened my life, all prepared me to do what I could do at a moment in history that I might not have otherwise had an opportunity had circumstances been different.
And we're going to talk about those who opposed your work, including a particular Protestant fundamentalist minister who happened to also be your mom.
Right. Well, I mean, and my work was, I was the symbol of an institution, of an organization that is the oldest, as you mentioned in the introduction, and the largest, and it is a multinational organization. So I was the symbol. I was not the worker. The work goes on at the very individual, personal, local level in the services that Planned Parenthood provides women and some men, but mostly women, and all of whom wish to have better reproductive control, reproductive health. And I'm really proud that the organization has broadened its services to include women that may not want to end pregnancy or prevent a pregnancy, but also enhance the possibility to be mothers. So it's a more than 100-year organization. And I came into the leadership from a local chapter at a time when it was under great siege. It was the beginning of the Reagan years, the epiphany of the moral majority and the Catholic bishops coming together politically to restore illegality for reproductive health.
And Miriam, I am so sorry that you have to follow Faye.
No,
And
don't be.
that's not a reflection
We all
on
do what we do.
your extraordinary background. Just, you know.
It's an honor. Please, there's no need to apologize. It is an honor.
At the end of the day, it's all about human experiences. We all have them. They're all powerful. And the challenge is whether we do something with it to make it a better life for other people, or whether we just stay in our own little shell and say, that's my experience and I don't have an obligation.
And I think I'm going to start with an extraordinary but mundane little factoid about you. In 2001, you were the lead lawyer on the single largest sublease in the state of California.
Yay.
And I mentioned that because your career trajectory is particularly fascinating in the variety of places that you've turned up in, that you've propelled yourself into. And
I'm the Forrest Gump of venture is how I like to think about it. You know how he was always like running around and he'd see Mao Zedong in the background or something.
Yeah.
I feel like that's been my life.
So you were at Ariba at the time when Ariba was, or maybe that was, I think that was Ariba, but Ariba was a Fortune 500 tech company, and you were inside counsel. You had gone to Stanford, picking up 3 degrees, I think all 3 on full scholarships. And I know you've since helped raise more than $250 million for scholarships for people who need them, which is also just an extraordinary impact. And then you went to a growing, surging startup called Google, where you became the second lawyer and helped take the company from several million in revenue to billions and billions in revenue. You were there long before it was public. And so you've been a startup founder as well. You then did angel investing, and you started your own venture fund. There's something in your bio that says that you have raised, that Ulu Ventures is one of the largest fund families led by an Afro-Latin woman. I don't know that there is a fund family or a venture fund family that is even close in size, in AUM, in reach, that's led by an Afro-Latin woman. Is there?
That's going to change, though. That's changing. I'm so glad to say. Like, I was just at Culture Shifting Weekend in Miami, and I met a young woman who is also Puerto Rican ancestry, considers herself a Black Latinx, and she raised a fund. So, like, there are more behind me. That's what we want, is to bring others along.
Right.
And it's extraordinary that I believe you're the only one who has so far raised funds exceeding $100 million per fund. And I also want to just, am I allowed to mention your TVPI? I don't want to get too personal.
Oh, you can, yeah, that's fine.
I can try, and then you can correct
You're
me.
going to mention way more personal about me than my TVPI.
Okay, so first of all, what is TVPI?
Total value to paid in capital. So it's kind of your markups against the amount you actually invested.
Right. And, you know, I'm mentioning this for a bunch of reasons, but you started Ulu Fund 1, I believe, in 2008. And it's a small fund. And for those of you old enough to have been in market or to remember, 2008, not a good year for the economy pretty much anywhere. And I believe that last I saw, TVPI on that fund was almost 6.5 times the value of the fund. Am I close?
Yes, on a gross basis and net, it would be a 5x net multiple.
Okay. And top quartile is 2.4x, which means, I don't know where you are, but top quartile is no longer relevant when you're, almost 2 or 3 times it. And I mentioned that in part because you are an outperformer in every sense of the word, and have competed on a global basis in every sense of the word. And so can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about maybe New York State and Florida agriculture?
Yeah, so my parents started out as migrant farm workers. My mom had actually been kicked to the curb by her father when she was, as a victim of incest, bore a child that was taken and given up for adoption. She later went to work in a household where she became pregnant by the owner of that house. So she was kicked out of there. And as a teenager, she came to Florida to work the crops, and she met my father. And I joke that I was conceived in Florida and I was born in upstate New York just because the timing works out that way. And they used to do the grape harvest in New York State and winter over there because we had uncles that had a auto body shop there and they could stay. My mom said that it was colder in the shacks that they had in Florida for migrant farm workers than it was in upstate New York, which if anybody's been near Buffalo, it's pretty cold up there. And they eventually migrated to Chicago.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're right, that is slightly more personal than TVPI. So how do you go from there to Stanford?
Well, through amazing teachers. And I have to say, for whatever reason, like, I feel like I had these angels along my path and they started very early. From Head Start, I was a Head Start kid, which I think really was transformative because my parents didn't know things like you should have books, you should read to kids. Basically my teachers were probably the Head Start and Sesame Street. So those are things that I think really changed the course of my life. And then I had amazing teachers who, like in the 2nd grade, one of them sought to get me a scholarship to a private day school that was like way too far out of Chicago for me to actually take, but she saw some promise and she wanted to try to help. I don't know what puts that in somebody's heart that they do that, but she was doing that for me. In the 6th grade, I had an amazing teacher who basically like woke up all the lights in my head and like helped me understand that my response to my circumstances, I had some aspect of control over that. And that helped me to realize that I would want to do something different from what others might have thought I'd become as an inner city kid. My father left when I was 9. My mother had less than an 8th grade education and she was raising 5 kids on her own. But in 7th grade, somebody said I should be a lawyer. And that meant that I had to actually go to undergraduate and law school. And then they helped me to identify a Better Chance scholarship program, which put me in a boarding school in New Hampshire, of all places, 10,000, a town of 10,000, everybody white, and then came to Stanford on a full scholarship eventually via the Land School of Chicago, where I transferred to be in a more urban and more diverse environment.
And I want to also, I know one of the things that you like to do, and I love that you like to do this, is give shout outs to people because you are a big proponent of extending the ladder behind you. And I want to give you an opportunity to extend the ladder in a slightly different direction. Your mom got her GED when she was how old?
She was about 51 when she got her GED, and that was really an achievement that, you know, she always wanted to finish high school because she didn't have an education. And it's a really proud moment for her.
And for you?
For me, obviously. Sorry, I'm like getting emotional about it, but you know, it's like when somebody achieves a dream like that, when they've literally, like, she was taken out of school before she finished 8th grade because she was supposed to be the caretaker for her family. And she didn't really have an opportunity to get an education. And, you know, I was saying we were Catholic, so she was pregnant a lot. And her mother had 21 live births, half of whom died in early childhood. So we were a very fertile family. If it wasn't for birth control, I don't know how many kids I would have.
Not the same, but my mother had many challenges in life, and I had the opportunity to attend as a teenager her graduation from an evening master's program, which she, you know, worked on for many years, and it enabled her to reshape her interaction in the business world. And I know how hard she worked and how important it was to her. And she, you know, she went back after a long time and had gone to City College, Brooklyn College at night. So so I can appreciate some of what you're of what you're talking about with your mom. And you know, I want to get to some of the technical stuff, but it's just so clear that we should be talking about moms right now. So I'm gonna continue this thread, and you're both welcome to redirect me. And so you talked about the incredible fertility in your family. Do you want to talk about stemming the tide of that fertility at all?
So when I've kind of mentioned, my mom unfortunately suffered sexual abuse when she was a child or teen. And then, you know, was kind of married off really young, frankly, because she became pregnant with me. My uncle literally took my mom and my older sister to my dad's house and said, "You got her pregnant, now she's yours." So that's kind of, you know, the treatment of women as chattel is something that I personally relate to. And I, you know, I observed firsthand, because I have 5 brothers and sisters. So we had 5 brothers and sisters that I grew up with, that when my mom became pregnant, it was a real source of violence in our family. So I would see my dad actually beat my mother when she was pregnant, in frustration for her being pregnant, as if it were her only, she was the only one involved. And in our family, my sister was unfortunately present when my mom self-aborted on at least 2 times. You know, the old coat hanger thing is not a myth, it is real. And I think my sister is permanently scarred from that. My mother and my sister do not enjoy a good relationship, in part because of the trauma that was inflicted on her as a small child. And so I raise that because I think for a lot of younger people, they really have no relationship to what unsafe, illegal abortion really is. And with Faye here, who's been a champion for women's rights and for abortion, I think it's really important that we talk about that reality.
Thank you for thank you for sharing that. Faye, do you want to respond?
Well, Miriam, thank you for sharing that journey. And as you were offering your background and your experiences and the experiences and traumas of your family, I thought about how common the journey can be for successful women who are perceived as having a life that is fulfilled and is the envy of many of our friends and our enemies and the assumptions that we've had it easy. In my lifetime, my great-grandmother was born a slave. She was born a slave on a Mississippi plantation, and I knew her. She died in 1957, so I'm sure you can tell that I was born well before 1957. But Mariah was born on a Mississippi plantation. I have her slave records and the documents that I'm working on to prepare for a memoir. So I'm an up from slavery descendant of a Black family from rural Mississippi. My mother was one of 9. She developed in a very early age a desire to have a better life than her father's, who was born. My great-grandmother gave birth to my mother's father as a single mother. So very often the mischaracterization that somehow the only legitimate births are those to married women, and that somehow out of wedlock pregnancies and births were an invention or a fiction of modern life, goes back to slavery when women were abused and exploited. And though my great-grandmother was a freed slave at that point, there's no question that she lived at a time of great servitude. And that informed a lot of what my family came to be as they migrated to the North for seeking a better life. And my mother's father was, interestingly, he was born of a white father, the identity of which we have not, as a family, been able to make to this day. We've not been able to find records of him. We think he came out of Arkansas as a traveling salesman, but by whatever measure, a Black teenage rural girl impregnated by a white father, was the early stage of my life's journey, my family's journey from rural Mississippi to the North. And I was born in St. Louis. There were 9 children in my mother's family. And when I was 6, in the early part of my life, I suffered a great deal I suffered with child abuse because my parents sent me to live in a foster care situation because my father came back from the war, World War II, with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so I knew, and I did experience very early in my life what it meant to be an abused child. But at the age of 6, my mother decided to be a full-time minister, to follow in the footsteps of her father. And that started a journey, a life of growing up on the road for me. After the 2nd grade of school, I did not attend the same school 2 years in a row. We traveled all over the country in mid-century revivals that were campaigns all over the country. There had been a spiritual revival among the Protestant denominations, and my mother took that on with full strength. And I was very often left in foster care. So a different school every year, not knowing where it would be the following year, in a different situation with a home that would take me in while my parents were on the road, just so that I could have schooling. 2 of the years were spent in Columbus, Nebraska, an all-white town. Then my mother pastored in an all-white congregation. So the trauma of living in that culture about which I had no experience or knowledge, in many ways prepared me for the work that I would later do, and which I had to relate to different cultures that were quite apart from my own. So I think that all of these experiences, as hard and as tough and as traumatic as they continue to be for us, even in our adult and senior lives, prepared us perhaps to make the kind of contribution that Miriam and I are trying to make to a better world for women that would hopefully do not experience the same traumas that we lived through and survived, but also give some inspiration that you can survive. But why should you have to? And I think of the trauma of beatings, and in my case, I still carry the physical scars of the abuse at the hands of foster care as a reminder of the inconvenience of my presence in my mother's career and my family's life. It really also left an obligation for me. I followed my mother's hopes that I would be a nurse. She wanted me to be a missionary nurse, but I got to Ohio State and the missionary somehow dropped off, and I continued my studies as a nurse at Ohio State. And had it not been for the program at that time that provided room and board free for the nursing majors, I probably would not have achieved a college education that ultimately led to a graduate degree and the work that I would do. So I came to the Planned Parenthood leadership from a preparation as a clinic, from a clinical perspective, and not only understanding what my life journey had been and what it could have been had the circumstances been different, but also in the care of women who had even more traumatic, encountered even greater traumas than those I survived in my growing up.
And
let me just also say, I mean,
yes.
I think it's at this stage, as we were talking Ed before we came on camera, during my Planned Parenthood years, I assiduously avoided speaking publicly about my personal journey. I did not want my personal journey to be the focus of the work that I'd been prepared and been given the privilege to conduct. I wanted my heart to feel what I needed to do in my leadership, but not I to become the symbol of that leadership in terms of, because of my personal experience. But it also gave me courage. It really gave me courage to say, you know what? Judge Bork has no right to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States, having written and spoken about returning women to the circumstances from which I had been given the opportunity to escape. And that these are not fictions. These are real human beings that suffer every day, that would be returned to a day in which that suffering would be further accentuated, and that the suffering could result in injury and death. And so I, as a nurse and as a nurse midwife, trained in a large clinical facility, Harlem Hospital, I saw those days before Roe v. Wade. I saw the days actually before contraception was even legal. You know, the Supreme Court only made contraception among married couples legal in the mid-60s. We are not talking about a long journey of liberation here, that we are confronting now, the reversal of those gains after so many years of perpetual erosion. I think it's sort of, it's sort of, you survive these experiences. Hopefully you come out of it with a heart wanting not to see other people suffer as you have. But it also puts grit in your courage to say, I'm not going to step down and let this happen to other women if I can do something to avoid it.
And you made this remarkable decision where you took Planned Parenthood, which had been a provider of medical services. There were close to 200 affiliates across the nation when you were running it. I think it had an almost $500 million annual budget in the early 90s at the time that you left your post after many years, which was among the largest nonprofit budgets in America at the time. You then said, hey, part of our mandate really should include shaping the United States Supreme Court. And you opposed and galvanized people to oppose Bork. You testified, you galvanized people to oppose Clarence Thomas. Wish you had been just a little more successful on that one. But
I
thank
do
you
too.
for trying. I know you do. Thank you for trying. And that is a tectonic shift for the organization. How do you lead an organization where I'm guessing most of the board members were older than you are, many than you were at the time? Many of the donors certainly, were and certainly had strong views. How do you decide, hey, we're now going to be an organization that doesn't just do this thing. We are also going to embark on the audacious goal of influencing the Supreme Court of the United States. And there is broader applicability to this question, right? Because many people want to mission align or values align their business. Many people want to have impact. Not everyone says, I'm going to shape the course of United States history, but thank you for doing that.
Well, it's not, they're not mutually exclusive, and we did not come to the Bork campaign out of whole cloth. In the early days of my presidency of Planned Parenthood, I had come from the local chapter as an executive director running a local 6-county chapter in Ohio. And even though we did not provide abortion services, we were vilified for providing services to teenagers without parental consent. So I had a taste when I came to the national leadership of what it meant, what it would mean to the work of the organization, but more importantly, the threats that loomed as I saw them. And I sought political advice as to what we needed to do very early in my presidency. At great peril to my presidency, there was an effort made to call for a vote of no confidence in my leadership in the early days of my national presidency, because we had been involved, or I personally, as the leader, had been privately involved and invited or suggested that we needed to become much more political and to develop a political strategy. That ultimately resulted in the Planned Parenthood Action Fund being formed. But before that, we opposed the so-called squeal rule. That was one of our first public policy battles. Now that battle was in the courts, but it was against the Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush's administration regulation, calling for any program that received federal funds that provided prescription birth control must report to the parents of minors within 10 days of providing those services. And I took the position, I took the mantle from the public positions of the organization that we will provide confidential services, and that this regulation was inconsistent and an anathema to those principles. Whatever the limitations of my mother's parenting might have been, the one thing that she did teach me by example was that you should stand up for what you believe. Now, she was a fundamentalist Protestant minister. She believed in a life of great sacrifice, a life narrowly defined in terms of lifestyle, appearance, conduct, no smoking, no drinking, no going to movies, no going to dances. I didn't go to I didn't go to a prom. So it was a very strict life, but she believed it, and she traveled the country. She preached against segregation. And so by example, by observation, I learned to stand up for what I believe in. And so it seemed it seemed just a foregone conclusion that if the organization says that it provides confidential services, that meant that everybody who comes to us for services would be provided on a confidential basis. It was not a hard decision to make. It was a very challenging time to fight the opposition within my own organization, because to make that statement when asked by the press, what are you going to do if you lose this particular case? To make that statement meant that we could possibly lose massive federal funding. But then we might not be able to serve teenagers who may get pregnant, who may have a life circumscribed by that pregnancy if we capitulate it. And fortunately, we live in a country that a private organization can sue the federal government and live to tell the story the next day. And we won. At that time, the courts were favorably disposed to striking down the proposed regulation, and we continue to serve teenagers without parental consent. But it was really out of my upbringing that you stand up for what you believe in. And my mother believed in something that I no longer, I never ever quite understood all of these things about golden streets and devils with pitchforks. None of that seemed to really make a whole lot of sense to me. But there were some guiding principles, just as there are guiding principles out of the 10th Commandments that we can all align our lives to, and hopefully with some degree of fealty conform to them. Now, so we had a political mechanism by the time the Bork hearings came around. But he had written so extensively and had spoken so adamantly against Roe v. Wade. Well, what was an organization to do except to speak out against him? And what is sometimes not remembered is that once a nomination is placed before the Senate of the United States, that's the one time that American citizens can speak on who is going to sit on a bench that arbitrates the rules of our society. The Supreme Court is the arbiter of the Constitution and how it expands and extends to modern life and to developments of human nature, of human development. And so it was reasonable that we were not going to sit quietly while a nominee that had written that that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided and had spoken adamantly against Roe v. Wade, that he go on the court without our opposition. And so it was something that seemed like a natural progression. It was not, we're going to take the organization into Supreme Court land. No, we were still defending women in the appointment or the nomination of this candidate that was unacceptable to the future reproductive rights of women. And that was not, although I must say that after we defeated Bork, there was an effort made to never again oppose a Supreme Court nominee because we lost donors. We lost people who felt that we had no business commenting on Supreme Court nominees. Well, every citizen should comment on Supreme Court nominees. It's our obligation as citizens to do that. It's the only time that we have some say, or should exercise that say, because once on the bench, it is what it is, as we are seeing now in the way the court is behaving with respect to the Texas law that it has allowed to go into effect.
And your comment that you don't believe in streets paved with gold and devils with pitchforks just tells me that you haven't spent a whole lot of time in Silicon Valley. So Miriam, the libertarians in Silicon Valley talk a lot about the right to privacy and all these other individual rights. They don't talk a lot about reproductive rights. I wish they would. It's part of why I wanted that centered in this conversation, because I see these rich, privileged so-called libertarians, and then they don't talk about the liberties of people who don't look like them. So you have built a values-based, and this is my interpretation of Ulu Ventures, you've built a values-based investment firm. You talked about not only scaling Google, but some of the success that you had at Google and that you witnessed at Google being in part a result of a diverse culture there that doesn't get talked about a lot. And so can you talk a little bit about how you build a values-based successful venture firm and what shaped that?
So maybe I'll start with a little bit of the history from Google, because I think it's something that really wasn't remarked on very much during the time that I was there. And I know, the company has changed and grown a lot. And in a lot of ways, the early generations of the leadership team have kind of been forgotten. But when I started at Google in 2001, it had only been in business for about 1.5 years at that time. And it was already a $20 million company in its first full year in business, grew to 85 million that year. And by the time I left in 5 years, it was a $10 billion company. So it was a pretty extraordinary firm. And part of what I saw that contributed to that was the diversity of the early team, which included 3 women vice presidents, 2 immigrants. They were both Persian, and our first general counsel was African American. Our first CFO was Cuban American. And then one of the things that I think was really interesting, and I think became a unfortunate model for Silicon Valley, is that in every team at Google, there were male-female dyads that ran almost every function. And so you typically had a male figure, not always, in the marketing and public relations team. It was a senior woman and a more junior man. But most of the teams were folks like Susan Wojcicki, who's now the CEO of YouTube, and Sergey Brin on the business development side. And then on the product side, it was Marissa Meyer and Larry Page, Sheryl Sandberg, Eric Schmidt, Miriam Rivera, and Dave Drummond, who was an African-American son of a Tuskegee Airman in the general counsel's office. So, and I think Silicon Valley took from that, we should always just make women COOs, because they can get stuff done and help build amazing companies instead of like making them CEOs, like what typically happens when somebody has been in a 2-down position and has helped to make something as successful as a Google. Sheryl, for example, running a $1 billion enterprise. I don't know, even before she was 40, I think, and then moving over to Facebook. But that model became the model of turn the women into the COOs of Silicon Valley. And from that perspective, I saw that a lot of people just weren't even thinking about how that had impacted the company and its ability to execute and to become what it did and is. And so I saw that as an opportunity because venture capital looked like 1950s America. When I started in 2008, it was 85% white male. There were probably fewer than 7% women partners. Certainly there were fewer than 1% Latinx or African American women in the field. And maybe you increase that to 2% if you think about Black men, for example. And so my sense was that this was crazy, given the composition of the country had changed so dramatically, and the fact that immigrant populations were also more educated than American populations, the fact that Asians were more educated than whites, and women were so educated and were getting like 2% of venture capital dollars. It made no sense whatsoever, given the realities of how life was shifting in our country. And so the values were both around being a financially driven first firm, and also that the way to be financially successful would be to invest in the changes that were really happening in tech and in business in this country. And that's really been our hypothesis, if you will, that diversity would actually outperform the traditional venture approach.
And when you think about the best performing companies in your portfolio, and you've constructed an atypical portfolio, and I want to talk about portfolio construction. And I know that when we surveyed the people who registered for this event, they wanted to hear about your portfolio construction approach, how a venture manager thinks about what to invest in and how much to invest in each company. Are the companies that are most successful in your portfolio companies that fit into your thesis on diversity outperforming?
If you look at it from a multiples perspective, yes. So, and for example, one of them is BetterUp, which recently raised about $300 million on a $4.7 billion valuation, and a multiple basis in our portfolio is about 153x return. And so that is a company that is led by a son of immigrants, and also one of them being a Latinx immigrant. So those two folks have really been the highest single performing investment that we have. But most of our companies that are outperforming are diverse teams, partly because about 91% of our current companies have a diverse member, whether it be a woman, underrepresented minority, or an immigrant.
And there's an interview that you gave, which you gave a really fascinating insight. And you said that part of your success at Ulu is, and this is paraphrasing or almost quoting, "We have much bigger networks that are diverse. That matters. I have been building diverse networks for more than 40 years. I challenge firms with solely white male partners to say that they have worked harder than me to build a diverse network. I will be better able to find and invest in diverse talent." And that is just such an important insight that I wish more people would key into, because there's something valuable about moving through the world with intentionality as you create your network. Is that something that you feel is intentional at this point for you, or what?
It's been intentional forever. But I think part of it is, it sounds like more instrumental than I think it may have actually been. Like when I first went to Exeter, New Hampshire, it was the summer of Saturday Night Fever, and I came in my 3-piece black polyester suit to the middle of New Hampshire, where everybody was dressed in LL Bean, and I stood out like a sore thumb. The group that kind of embraced me was a group that was called the Afro-Exonian Society, and frankly, that was the only diverse group on campus. So everybody was a part of it: the Asian kids, the Puerto Rican kids, the Black kids, and most of us were first-generation college kids. And so, one, I think it's just a function of needing community, right? Like at that time, there wasn't a minority faculty member, there wasn't a minority staff member, not even the janitors, like, to be honest, like even the working class jobs were in a white town, like of 10,000 people in New Hampshire, were held by white people. So the school was experiencing 50% attrition. When they hired 2 Black staff members, one the minister of the Exeter Church, and then another one on the admission side, they were an African-American couple. that attrition dropped almost overnight. Just because community is actually important to human beings, and having adults that could help 14-year-old kids navigate this high school experience was tremendously important. So part of it is people of color and women tend to invest in diverse networks because that is actually influential in our ability to succeed within institutions. So some of it is completely self-interested and needing that support and guidance. And then other is that we still have to invest in our professional networks. Like I still go to the American Bar Association. I go to American Corporate Counsel Association if I'm counsel. I still go to general NVCA events. But then I go to Culture Shifting Weekend with the Latinx and Black community of venture capital. I go to Kauffman Fellows, which is one of the more diverse and global networks, right? So, so part of it is you need that support in order to succeed, and the mainstream probably doesn't need as much of that.
And when you say you go to Kauffman Fellows, which is a multi-billion-dollar endowment and a super prestigious program for people in venture, you're also on the board, you're on the investment committee, you're on the you've been on the governance committee. I think you may chair the investment committee or have chaired the investment committee at Kauffman. So there's a
Kauffman Foundation and the Kauffman Fellows are two different organizations. Kauffman Fellows spun out of the Kauffman Foundation, but yes, I am the chair of the investment committee of the Kauffman Foundation.
Yeah, I'm just saying that you're playing at a different, you're playing at a different level. And Faye, in terms of seeing the intentionality, and it's different for folks who look and present like me, because we would be welcome in a group that is non-diverse. I mean, not after I talk, but just this way. And so it's less of a struggle to find my people who look like me, right? Whereas if you go to Silicon Valley, or if you go, and so quantum computing is such a new space. When you are networking and building in quantum, is it a much more inclusive place? Are people seeing opportunity, or is it just as bad as other places?
Of course it is. No, of course. I mean, have you seen other African-American women speaking about quantum computing? But that's the cross we have to bear. Okay. I don't have a whole lot of patience for the notion for those of us of color who end up in boardrooms, not doing a suit and complaining about the fact that we're just tokens. Well, it does take a token to get through the gate. And the question is, do you bring others with you after you get there? Do you see it as a part of your mission in the boardrooms? Because that's where the power still resides, to create change and to be sometimes the skunk at the garden party, to raise the issues and to insist upon them until there is a will to diversify the circle. It's not just for cosmetic reasons, it's for better. I mean, the data is pretty accurate, but even if the data didn't always support the mission, we should still strive for diversity and diverse perspectives in whatever settings we may find ourselves. And for those of us who are really lucky to find ourselves in the more powerful seats of our society, we have an extraordinary obligation to do something about changing the profile. So I think it's on us. We have to really continue to pay off that debt of privilege by bringing others, whether it's in quantum computing or in whatever what other forums we may be involved in.
So, and I see Stephanie Diaz has dropped in the chat that she loves the line, "Do you bring others with you?" which is so important. And Rachel's token takes the token to start building towards not being the only. Although if you're bringing one, bring two. If you're bringing two, bring three. So Miriam, you're investing in more companies than most. You're reserving follow-on capital in a smaller amount than most. And if I were a skeptic, and since you and I both went to law school, although I don't think I got into the law school you applied to and matriculated at, I might say, do you not have confidence in your ability to pick winners? Is that why you invest in so many companies and follow on in fewer than others? So what's the story?
I would say that nobody can pick winners. If you look at the portfolio of the best venture firms, that include Sequoia, for example, according to data that we've seen, maybe 4.5% of their investments generate around 2/3 of their returns. So 4.5% is not that great of a average in terms of being able to pick winners. Now, I think the thing that helps to create winners in a portfolio is a relatively large portfolio, and people get there in different ways. Sequoia has way more partners than Ulu, so they get there by having a couple of investments per partner per year, and then over a period of a fund, they now have a much larger portfolio than a venture fund that would have 2 investments per partner and only 1 or 2 partners, right? So I think that people often mistake the small portfolios of an individual partner with what is actually good portfolio construction. And when you think about it, there are 4,000 to 6,000 investments made at the pre-seed, seed, early stage. How many are there at B? There's 600 or 700. So the level of attrition is massive. And in order for you to be able to end up with good results, I think it's ridiculous to think that you're going to do it by having a small portfolio and watching the basket. And I know that's very common saying that works in what are normally distributed outcome businesses. But early stage venture is not normally distributed. It is power law distributed, which means that there are returns that are greater at the tail end, meaning very few things generate the highest rate of return. So it's just a different portfolio construction because the underlying distribution of returns is different from every other asset class.
And how do Sequoia has more partners, Sequoia has more AUM. Can we talk a little bit about brand equity value? You have been
a lot of brand equity value. I really respect what they do. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs do as well. And they've also been able to add diversity and intergenerational development in a firm, which is pretty rare in Silicon Valley. A lot of firms pretty much die out when the first generation of founders ages out. Yeah.
And I know that you've also talked about your admiration of what they've done in that regard, and it's something I respect as well. How do you compete against the brand equity of funds like Sequoia or other really name brand funds that are spending on marketing and are doing a blitz? And my sense is Ulu's marketing budget is a little different, and you haven't weaponized marketing the way Andreessen Horowitz has, for instance.
Yeah, I think we have 1/2 person that works on our marketing and communications and website and things like that. So yes, our marketing is not a big part of our budget. So there are a few ways that I think we compete. One of them is people actually care about the industry that we're in. As entrepreneurs, we have all white teams that come to us and say, we want to be a part of Ulu Ventures because of what you're doing in terms of increasing diversity in venture. We have, women teams that are coming to us. One is people want to be a part of creating a positive change in this industry. And they also, entrepreneurs are becoming more sophisticated, and they realize that they are a part of the world of assets under management, where 1.3% of the world's wealth is invested in firms that are led by women and people of color. Their returns are making this system perpetuate itself, and they don't want to be a part of that. So that is moving people in new directions and new firms. And I think that in addition, there is a benefit like to high performance. One of the things is people like to be associated with a high performing fund. They like to be associated with other companies that are successful, and to be a part of a network of diverse, super passionate, high impact people like the Ulupreneurs in our portfolio.
And so part of that answer is clearly, hey, Ed, don't diss our brand equity. We have tremendous brand equity. We have it with people who give a shit about what's important. Sequoia and Andreessen have it with everyone, and they need a big team because they've got to filter out a lot of noise. The people who come to us are like, they're sophisticated customers because they understand our brand, and that's why they're coming to us.
And they understand the world, and their part in it, and they want to change the world.
So, and I'm going to come back to Faye with a question about how EuroQ competes with Google and others. But so why are you funding a smaller number of them in the next round? And I think of Ulu as being a very, like, I'm not sure that there's an investor at Ulu who isn't terrific at math. I think of Ulu as being a very mathematically based venture fund. Am I wrong about that?
We would use quantum computing if it helped us make better returns, let me tell you.
So are you really heavily math based, and why are you, when you double down, why is it a much smaller number? How do you get there?
When we double down on, sorry,
when you, so many seed funds will invest 3 or 4 times, or they'll invest in a larger percentage of their portfolio company. They'll reinvest, they'll re-up into a larger percentage of their and you've got a much narrower funnel.
Yeah, that's true. We typically, maybe 30% of our funds will be invested in follow-on investments in our own portfolio, which is kind of the opposite of the double down on your winners strategy. And part of that is the highest returns are typically at the earliest stages. And this is all just common sense, right? Like, you buy low, you sell high. And what typically happens with a lot of venture returns is that in the early stages, a company is doing really well, and it can get priced really quickly out of your league. So if we look at SoFi, before it was a public company, it was an 89x in our portfolio from the first round investment, but the next round was an 8x return to the Series B investors. And that's just because companies get priced sometimes out of proportion to the amount of de-risking that they've done in the interim. And it takes a while before the price and the value are more aligned. What we're good at doing is trying to identify when to bow out and allow dilution to take its course, because we've actually factored in dilution from the beginning. It always makes me laugh when people say they're going to get diluted and that's why they need to invest their pro rata. If you just think about what the average rate of dilution is and apply it to your investment, you should know what your dilution will be at the end, right? And there's a range typically, and it could be very big, 60 to 80% even, but it's not an unknowable sort of impact from dilution in terms of your portfolio. So a lot of the things that are taken as common sense, when we looked at them, we looked at the same portfolio construction that is typically done, where people, reserve half or more of their money for future rounds. And we looked at putting it all up front, and that was actually the best way to maximize returns. And guess what? It also maximized ownership.
And so can you share what percentage of your portfolio you will double down on, or share one or two of the things that would be a decision point between, yes, this one we do double down on and this other one we don't?
Yeah, it's the same criteria as for our initial investment. When we look at a forecast of what we think the return will be on a company, we need to see that it has the possibility of generating a 10x probability weighted multiple. And that's true for every follow-on investment. So we are investing, typically, it's very difficult, and pitch book data and other data will show this. It's very difficult to do that after about a Series B. So most of the time, our last investment would be at about a Series B, if that. But the majority of our companies, we would probably not follow on beyond an A. And the only company that I think we've made an exception for was really Palantir. And that we entered as a C extension that converted into the D, and it still generated over a 10x probability weighted multiple. So it's pretty rare for us to invest at later stages, but we use the same criteria as 10x probability weighted multiple.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how the returns and markups that we're seeing this year are going to change the landscape of what venture outcomes are supposed to look like and how we benchmark against them, because we're in a distorted reality for sure. I'm not saying it's unsupportable. It may or may not be unsustainable, but it's a distorted reality. And speaking of distorted reality, quantum computing, you chose, congrats on choosing a field that seems very capital light, doesn't take a lot of money. You get pretty quick results. You're not trying to solve hard problems. What were you thinking going into something so damn hard? And how do you compete against really well capitalized companies like IBM, Google, Honeywell? Frankly, how can any quantum computing startup that's not massively capitalized compete with those companies?
Well, there are a number of answers to that question, and we have a vision of what we want to do in quantum, and we believe that the vision is informed by focus. We have chose a pathway of electrons on helium, which is not, we do not have competitors in that channel. And so the Googles and the IBMs and the other competitors, we don't see as competitors. We see that our approach will ultimately be the superior approach in quantum computing development. There will be, it's not a zero-sum game. Just as in my former career, Planned Parenthood was not the only provider of healthcare services in that space. There were others. There were others who had different approaches. There were others whose application was more suitable to their particular customer base, as you might compare it. And we think that the same will be true in quantum computing. In it's a very hard science. It's a very small circle. The talent base is pretty narrow, and we have focused over the last 5 years in hardware and not software. And we believe that that gives us an advantage in addition to the technological approach that we have selected for both long-term scalability as well as reliability in addressing some of the challenges of coherence and other challenges on the way to quantum reality and application. There isn't one silicon maker. There isn't one computer maker today. And so if we think about it as an evolution of technology and engineering, there won't be a single quantum computer. There will be multiples. It's not a zero-sum game, but we believe that electrons and helium will provide a much more stable product, that the qubits will not require a block-long compilation of machinery, that it's a much more elegant and refined approach to quantum computation.
And how are you thinking about regulation of quantum computing?
Well,
Miriam, if you have questions about quantum, feel free to jump in and override me here.
Please. Let's just, this is not 50 years ago, 50 or 60, I guess it would be now 70 years ago, when computers became a reality of where it has gone. We had no idea. Quantum enters, the evolution of quantum science enters an environment of enormous technological pressures. And so you can't ignore the reality of the landscape in which you are traveling there, because of the lack of foresight as to what current technologies might bring and how it might evolve. We now find ourselves with a lot of vexing societal problems for which there will be regulatory response. There already is, and we can anticipate that there will be more. Let us, I mean, I as I said earlier, I come from the medical establishment. The biomedical considerations out of violations against human beings by the medical profession has necessitated the creation of their fairly strict and rigorous regulations. Let us hope that in learning through biomedical regulations, in considering the regulatory environment of artificial intelligence, that we can take from that some of the lessons that would frame a regulatory consensus as to how quantum computing can be applied. You know, quantum will not come upon us in a midnight clear. It will also evolve. The quantum computers that will go effective, that will become effective, will not be the quantum computers of 20 or 30 years from now. It will be an evolution. But what, you know, we're not moving on a landscape that is not fraught with a great deal of consensus that more needs to be done to rein in the tech companies and to rein in the kind of violations of privacy and destabilization of democratic processes that we now are struggling with, as an environment in which quantum will enter, and that there will be a desire to somehow corral the powers of quantum because of the past challenges and the past offenses that have occurred.
Miriam, I don't know if you want to jump in. You're welcome to, and if not, I've got a question for you. But go ahead.
Well, I do want to say, I don't know, Experian and the IRS have both gotten my information lost to the black web. So I'm a little bit concerned about whether the breakup of companies is really the right strategy compared to regulating the transmission of data amongst various parts of these companies. And so I really think that the tech companies are better at protecting data than the government, except perhaps, black ops from within the military.
Well, certainly in quantum, the tech companies present very significant national security and sovereign issues that excusing the government out of the regulatory process is not a reality. and that,
No,
you know,
they actually need
that's,
to
yeah.
do the job of regulating. But
Okay.
I agree. They haven't been
Yeah.
doing that in terms of how information gets used or who can have access to it.
Right.
But once they actually do that job, the tech companies are better able to actually.
Well, the problem is whether they can do that job without, given the massive construction of, I mean, our top 3 companies in this country are tech companies, right? Whether that's possible, even possible, given the scale and the enormity and the diversity of sectors that these tech companies now impact and really have enormous control. That's the question of whether that can be accomplished without, in the current structure, corporate structure that has been allowed to evolve. I mean, there is a real backlash. I mean, whether the industry wants to recognize it or not, there is a backlash against technology that is evolving because of concerns about privacy, because of concerns that Siri is now recording me and I didn't even know it. These are the day-to-day reactions that we can expect that citizens will, you know, that it will eventually evolve into an enormous opposition to some of the developments and a desire to crack down on these practices and the very technology that allows them.
Miriam, how do you think about assessing legal risk? You know, you've done this for a Fortune 500 company at Ariba, you've done this for Google. You've not only done this at Ulu, but you also brought in your mentor who was at Ulu, who was the GC of Ariba. How do you think about looking at and investing behind risk, particularly because you are a pure play seed investor? And so these companies are going to go out there and build a business that gets subjected to regulation.
Well, first of all, it's interesting because the first and most impactful thing that's happened with technology companies and risk has been the interactions between like real human beings and technology that's happened. So like when you think about companies like Uber and Lyft, and in our own portfolio, Zoom, which provides transportation to kids and schools, when you're talking about human life, you're really talking about risk. And I think a lot of companies in the past, you know, when you're talking about risk, you're talking about economic damages. It's a very different world. You know, if Google does something with data that violates a law, they pay a fine. If people using Lyft are, you know, put in a car with an unsafe driver or worse, you know, they suffer real physical harm. And so I think that's been one of the interesting areas, and to see some of the different notions around the use of technology. I've been in meetings where I've heard VCs saying things like, I don't want our entrepreneurs thinking about risk and legal things at all. And you're kind of like, what is that about? What world do they live in?
What world do you live in,
Yeah,
right?
you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
do you not care that this could be your mother or your brother? You know, when you're talking about this intersection of technology and humans, that's happening more and more now, where technology is everywhere and we're all carrying it in our pocket and we're all using services that bring technology into the real physical world. And so I think that that's it's an irresponsible perspective, and that the smart businesses learn how to navigate the law, they learn how to navigate politics, and they actually care what happens to their customers. End of story. If you want to add value for the long term, you build a business that respects your customers.
Well, but Miriam, I think that the pandemic has really unclothed people not really caring. The reaction to the vaccines, which is the product of, or are the products of an enormously sophisticated scientific community. And aren't we lucky to live in a country where we have the benefits of that? and the reaction to not wearing masks has been a disturbing coda of behavior and reactions. I'm living in a city where there is threatening a quarter of the fire department not to show up if they are compelled and required to have vaccination. I mean, this is a challenge to basic science that we all had to follow when we went to school. And so I guess out of the pandemic, I have less my faith in people caring about, we came up, I'm sorry, I'm much older than you are probably, but came up at a time when it was the women's movement, it was the civil rights movement. We had a vision for this country that we could care about the sectors that really were disadvantaged and that did not enjoy the fruits of what this country could offer. Where have we lost that social contract? I think that there's a lot of restoration that we're going to have to do before we achieve that kind of caring atmosphere again, if it is at all possible.
And I mean, part of it is when we were talking a few minutes ago about the government regulation and, can you trust the government? One of the things that we saw in the Obama administration was an effort to recruit incredibly talented, sophisticated people with tech and science backgrounds. And then we went through a period of dismantling that and saying, if you know how to sell a pillow on TV, that's good enough for me. You should probably be in charge of something. And that's been frickin' insane. We really need to actually think about how many people with advanced science degrees are sitting in the United States Senate. How many people who've actually been first responders or served in the military are sitting in the United States Senate? How many people who are nurses or doctors are sitting and serving in the United States Senate or in Congress? And F my pillow, right? Like it's kind of crazy because these are really complex situations. And when you have someone like Chrissy Houlihan or Shuttle Commander Mark Kelly, or someone who has a deep understanding of public health, like we have in Chicago. It's just a very different. We're playing at a different level, and that's the level that we need to play at. And I think that we need to see some accountability, which also means that people who've done really well in tech and are civic minded and understand the desirability of public trust should also, take some of those jobs, particularly if they're taking them away from the Louis DeJoys of the world. So I do want to also ask about. So you've both served on incredibly prestigious boards. Miriam, you are on the board or were on the board for years of I'll call it a junior university, Stanford Leland Junior University. And Faye, you were on the board of an Ivy League university from which you obtained a graduate degree. And one of the things that the people who registered for this event wanted to know in advance was, how do you get on that? How do you create the opportunity to get onto that board? And if you find yourself in that kind of room, and it doesn't have to be, that board specifically, if you find yourself in that kind of room, how do you squeeze every bit of juice out of that lemon?
So for myself, I think joining the Stanford board is actually part of a process that they have to make board trusteeship available for all alumni. I joined the Stanford board through the Alumni Association process, which has a public application process that's open to all of the alums, and was able to start on that board in that way. The things that and it's a very competitive process, but that is one of the ways in which I think good governance is done at a university, because they want to have all kinds of people from different backgrounds, and not necessarily have a board that's comprised only of the largest donors, which is a real potential for a lot of not-for-profits to kind of lose touch with their constituencies, because their board composition isn't reflective of their community. And so that process, I think, was very helpful. And then in terms of, being on there, I remember that there were very few women. Like, it's like a 30-something person board, and maybe there were something like 4 or 5 women. And there is a little bit of a perception that there's usually like one Latino seat on the board. And so I was going to replace the prior Latina woman, who was like the first Latina astronaut that went into space, kind of thing. And but I remember walking into the room and realizing that the only person that I really kind of knew were all the tech people. So I went and sat on the tech people side, like with Ram Shriram, who was on the board at Google, and Jerry Yang, who was the then CEO of Yahoo again. And so, and later on, the women told me that I had shifted the whole room, because there was a girls part of the boardroom and the boys part of the boardroom. And I happened to just walk over to the boys side without recognizing that that's what I was doing. So one is, the representation is absolutely important, right? Because without people there, a lot of these dynamics really do tend to occur. Like, if you don't have a representative group, you'll end up with all the social dynamics that happen because of minority and majority voices in a space. And then in terms of the things that have happened, like, I think trying to understand where and how you can be of service. Like, to me, when the 2008 crisis occurred, it really became clear that financial aid was going to be my thing, because what did I believe in the most? One is that Stanford is actually one of the most affordable educations you can have in the country, because we provide scholarships to anybody whose family earns under $100,000, which is the majority of Americans. So in order to try to continue that tradition, Stanford actually was free until the Depression to all comers that were admitted. Now, at that time, there were plenty of people that weren't in the consideration set, but the idea of trying to pick some of the issues that are important, and that also I think others can really rally around, is helpful. And for us, the diversity and the financial aid program are really just integrally mixed at Stanford. There are some classes where we have 20% first generation kids coming to college, and most of them are coming for nearly free. And then now we've got lots more women on the board, and we have 4 Latinos on the board, whatever. Like, and then in terms of the Kauffman program, we had two minority people that have been on the board, and now we're getting 2 more. So like, we're bringing people behind us. We're not done.
You're lifting all boats. So my tenure on the Columbia board started at the behest of David Stern, who was then the NBA commissioner and chair of the board. And to, as an illustration of cross-board connections, he and I also, he's deceased now, but he and I at that time also sat on the board of Jazz at Lincoln Center. And it was during those interactions, he learned that I had completed my graduate studies at Columbia, and he asked if I would be willing to sit for the board. Miriam, the selection of the Columbia board is not nearly as democratic as the one that you describe at Stanford. It's much more individual by individual invitee. So it's a more closed circle. And when I joined the board, it also had a disproportionate small number of women on the board, which was an improvement. I'd like to say, I mean, I've also served on public company directorships, and I'm sometimes asked, how did that happen? And often the public company directorships come out of relationships on nonprofit boards. Nonprofits are corporations. They have the parallel accountabilities and headaches and challenges that for-profit companies contend with, which for-profit companies contend. And those are relationships that sometimes result in being invited to public company directorships. So my career started in the nonprofit world. It evolved very much to the for-profit world. My first public company board directorship was a garment company board that made dresses. And I had no experience in the garment business, but I had a lot of experience some experience with accountability and accounting. And I was invited to that board just as an accounting scandal broke. And I had the option, and I was invited to either accept or to forego what was a very troubled situation. And I decided to accept it, that perhaps I could make an impact with fresh eyes, but also that I might learn something out of that experience. So I knew nothing about the garment industry, but I learned a lot about the commonality of corporate obligation and corporate governance. There are really guiding principles that get corporations into trouble regardless of the nature of the enterprise.
And I'm glad that you said that there is a pathway from a nonprofit board into a public company board. One thing that I've seen that I found super frustrating is that when we think about systemic racism and homophobia and misogyny, it's you have to have done it first in order to be considered for it here rule. And I have definitely seen amazing women who have run large organizations, who are responsible for huge budgets, who've made lots of people wealthy, and they are invited to serve on nonprofit boards. Those are boards that often you are paying to serve on. And then people say, well, how many public company boards are you on? Because I'd like to consider you for public company board. And they say none, but I've run this business and I've served on these, huge nonprofits that are legendary. And that's the end of the conversation. And it's worse for intersectional women. And we have to figure out how to break that. We also have to stop calling it unconscious bias. It is 100% conscious systemic bias. And I'm glad to hear that there's an endorsement of that pathway and to see that it leads someplace. I did ask people to share in the chat. There are a lot of organizations that are working on this because this is a persistent problem. And I know, Miriam, you and I have talked about the GP commit, meaning how much money you as a founding partner or as a senior partner in a venture fund are putting in to the fund, how much of your own money. And in a country that has had an intentionally created and perpetuated wealth gap, having a GP commit is one of the ways that that we as straight white men stay on top, right? Because you can't create wealth by founding your own venture fund if you don't have the wealth to then invest in it, and we're going to judge you based on how big a check you write. And that's a great way to be classist and to calcify the systemic barriers that we've created. We talked a bit about regulation, and one of the things that I want to know from you is, what are some of the other things that we're not talking about enough in venture and startups that are other manifestations of this kind of systemic racism? Because I think people are talking more about the GP commit as a requirement to starting a venture fund. And I'm also happy to throw out the first one, but Miriam, I don't know if you have a particular view, and Faye, if you do, love to hear it as well.
Definitely. So one thing is there are a lot of funds that are being raised to support diversity. And yet many of those funds, even if they have Black and brown faces associated with it, do not have decision-making power in the hands of those brown and Black faces. Some of them don't have the economic upside of those funds associated with the success of those funds. And if you go up and down Sand Hill Road and you really try to understand how many of the people there really have access to ownership in the business and have access to the upside of their work, there are really a lot of highly paid, I would say there's a lot of highly paid performative diversity on Sand Hill Road, and that they are not changing the underlying structure by giving access to wealth building to the diverse people that are working in the funds. And that's I would say, one of the most disturbing things about this recent emphasis around raising diversity funds at some of the larger institutions.
And how often do you hear, and Faye, if you've got an analog, or if this is something you've seen as well, how often do you hear, Miriam, and I know that there's an interview that you gave where I heard you talk a little bit about this. Yeah, we'd invest in Ulu, but you don't need our help. If we're investing in funds run by Black and brown people or by intersectional women, we're really focused on giving them a pat on the head and helping those who are, less fortunate than we are.
Yeah, I mean, I've been told that so many times. And in a lot of ways, I will say that it's been my experience that this is really often coming from more liberal investors than from more conservative investors. And that this is, I think, also, maybe part of the white savior complex, where, the idea of trying to invest in people who, I feel like I've been a beneficiary of dramatic amounts of philanthropy. I probably received about $250,000 worth of scholarship over the course of my education. And yet I have been told by really some of the biggest liberal investors in funding diverse managers that I am now too privileged to actually be invested in by them.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, what I took it to mean, and what they were saying, was that investing in people who could actually break the glass ceiling was going to make the gap between the diverse people that could break the glass ceiling and the diverse people who couldn't even bigger. And therefore, that was not something that was aligned with their sense of what was beneficial for society.
In other words, you've gone far enough.
Yeah, you've gone far enough. You got it, Way. I mean, this is insane. And so, yes, I'm committed to helping to invest in diverse people who can break the glass ceiling. And why? Because I don't think they're going to give the same answer to other people that will follow them.
So this is one of many things that drives me crazy, and I realize it's not a far ride for me. And it's something that also perplexes people about First Close Partners, which is the fund that Carolina Huaranca and Betsy Zimmerman run, that I am part of and co-founded with other friends. And we are proud investors in Ulu, and I know that, and you were very kind because we came back to you and said, we have a little more money. Is it okay if we put a little more into Ulu, because we really believe in Ulu? And you were very gracious about that. We didn't realize we were raising a fund, so we ended up raising a fund, but which is great. Our view has been, holy shit, when you have someone who performs and can prove out the thesis, I don't want to be screwed out of my allocation, because ultimately people will realize that their greed should overwhelm their racism, and they will realize that they were wrong and that they should have invested in Ulu, they should have invested in A-Crew, they should have invested in 645, they should have invested in Ingressive, they should have invested in Backstage, they should have invested in Cake, they should have invested, like all these funds. And I want to get in before the racists realize that they now have to get an allocation because they're going to write bigger checks than I can. So I don't, and Urban Us, yes, thank you, Stonely. So I think it's just so important to realize that people are, and I see Nora May, I see you, we invested in you folks as well. Yes, these are fantastic opportunities. And I just don't get why they think this is, there's racism and bias in the way they're looking at these funds, not as money-making opportunities, but as frickin' handouts, and it's not philanthropic dollars.
Well, but Ed, why is that a mystery? They are part of our culture, our society, and they come from with all of the biases that accrue to many institutions, if not all of our institutions.
It's not a mystery. It needs to be talked about more, and it's because Miriam was kind enough and candid enough to call out that it's the liberals among us who are saying that. And as people who want to be and fund the change, we cannot say stupid shit like you can't get too big. We cannot say stupid shit like we don't think of you and evaluate you the way we evaluate our other opportunities to make money.
As ironic as it may sound, once upon a time, they didn't say it out loud. It was just that they just acted it out loud. And we were left with, oh, well, it must be something wrong with me. And so people like Miriam proves that there ain't nothing wrong with me. I'm as brilliant and as successful as any of the rest of you. And so this now is, we're taking it to another level because I've got these credentials. I can say these things and I'm okay saying these things to you, but it's still the same old game.
And my mother, going back to mothers, she was basically thrown away, and she made a life, raised 5 kids. She basically took it as a challenge to show what she could do and who she could be.
She was quite a manager, wasn't she?
She was definitely quite a lot of many things, but one of the things that she was bold, and she did not give up. And persistence is 9/10 of success.
So I know that we're going to have to run in a minute. There are about 3 things I want to just get out there, and then Faye, I need to ask you about racism and Margaret Sanger and so we'll come back to that in a sec. So one other thing I want people to think about is the accredited investor standard is racist, and the fact that the law is requiring people to say, here's a letter from my investment manager, here's a letter from my banker, here's a letter from my accountant, here's a letter from my lawyer saying I am an accredited investor. That is vouching. Vouching is what we used in the South to tell Black people that they could not register to vote because they needed 3 registered voters to vouch for them, and the only registered voters were white people. Vouching is bullshit, and I've seen it. I've particularly seen it with Black women and how difficult it is, and that it puts them in an embarrassing position. I feel terrible that I am part of the problem because I am a lawyer. I work at a law firm. We represent venture funds. We form venture funds. I co-run First Close, and we need accredited investor letters. I have ways that I've been thinking about working around it and implementing workarounds. It is racist bullshit, and we need to fix it. So I wanted to put that out there. In terms of nonprofit engagement, if people are interested in the Center for Policing Equity, where I'm the vice chair of the board, or Fisk University in Nashville, which is an HBCU that I've been on the board of for a while, and I'm very fond of. Feel free to drop me a line, let me know. We're hosting, Betsy and I and Shafar and Tananya, and I think Tananya was on earlier. We are hosting Wes Moore for governor fundraiser next week. If people are involved or interested, drop me a line. Don't at all feel obligated. It's not a Lowenstein thing, it's an Ed Zimmerman thing. And so with that, Faye, Margaret Sanger, super problematic. Your existence is in a sense a repudiation. You want to talk about that a little?
My leadership was an affirmation of the sacrifices that Margaret Sanger made to make birth control available to women. It has been an unfortunate distortion of her contributions to the advancement of women, and without the sacrifices that she made in the early part of the 20th century, the advances in contraceptive technology, let alone services, would not have been made. Now, I think and by the way, the attacks on Margaret Sanger were attacks that I encountered during my entire presidency of Planned Parenthood. It is true that during the early days of her work, and she became devoted to birth control because of her mother's repeated pregnancies, 18 of them, it was reported, and the suffering that she saw, not among Black women, but among poor white women on the Lower East Side of New York, that something had to be done. And through her determinations and her wiles with men, she was able to get them to separate with their money to help her with her work. She traveled to Europe to learn about birth control technology, and ultimately was repeatedly jailed for producing and distributing birth control on the streets of New York. So that the focus of Margaret Sanger's work was not on Black women and eliminating the Black race. I mean, I was accused of being engaged in activity to eliminate my race. People will accuse you of a lot of things that do not reflect your motivations. It is true that during the period of her pioneering work in birth control, that the eugenics movement was a very respected movement. It was accepted. It was legal. Her movement was illegal. It was illegal to pass her literature out and to pass it through the mails. You were sent to jail for that. So people who attack Margaret Sanger, I just say, well, was it after she was in jail 3 times that she spoke against, that she spoke with the eugenicist? She felt she was an opportunist. She felt that if they would accept birth control, maybe that would find its acceptability. So I do not condemn her. I think that she laid the groundwork, she laid the foundation. It was through her efforts that the early investment in the development of oral contraception was made, that she was able to get the money to fund Dr. Rock and his team that began that early journey for oral contraception that led to women being able to control their fertility without having to apply birth control at the time of sexual intercourse. She had a checkered journey, as most pioneers do, but she was not motivated by racism. She was motivated by a desire to see, and by the way, she started the organization as the American Birth Control League and left it because it became known as Planned Parenthood, because her organization, as she saw it, was an organization that was the liberation of women, not the planning of parenthood, that women could be okay and not be parents. And her view was that it needed to be in a woman's hands. She smuggled diaphragms in from France when those were illegal, and that the power needed to be in the woman's hand to control her fertility, and not with the government dictating and with men dictating what that should be for her.
So I want to thank you both for this. It for me to hear it was extraordinary, and I did not expect. We did not expect to get the personal stories that we got at the top. In the spirit of sharing. I am the child of a baby who was attempted unsuccessfully to have been aborted, which is something that my mother carried with her. And reproductive rights are very important to me. I know that had there been reproductive rights at the time, my mother would not be here or have been here, and I would not be here. Reproductive rights are super important to me. It is not self-annihilation. I really thank you both for the extraordinary work that that you have done. And Miriam, thank you also for sharing the stories of sexual assault. I know the insanely high market share sexual assault has had on the members of my immediate family who identify as female. And I have to believe that that is not that is not atypical, and so it's something that should be more part of conversation. Appreciate all of you being here for this, and I am happy to hear the good and the horrible in terms of feedback afterwards. Thank you all for everything, and thank you to the VentureCrush team and to Angela, who also makes all of this stuff possible, as well as Shelmy and Latoya.
Thank you
See you
for
soon.
inviting me.
And thank you, Ed, for sharing your own story. And I like Faye's thought that her soul would have found its own home. Even if your mom had been successful, your soul would have continued to bring this greatness to the world.
It would have found a temple.
Thank you all.
Thank you.